Picture this. It's February 1867, and you're a cowboy trailing 3,000 head of cattle across the frozen plains of Kansas. The temperature has plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The wind is cutting through you like a razor blade, and you're 200 miles from the nearest town. You have no heated shelter, no electric blankets, no modern camping gear. Just you, your horse, and whatever you could roll up behind your saddle. In 6 hours, when the temperature drops another 15 degrees and the blizzard really starts howling, you'll either wake up alive or you'll be a frozen corpse that won't be found until spring thaw. So how the hell did cowboys survive nights that should have killed them in hours? The answer will completely destroy everything Hollywood taught you about frontier life. These men didn't just endure deadly winters. They developed sleeping systems so ingenious, so perfectly engineered for survival, that when modern military experts discovered them, they couldn't believe they actually worked. But here's the truth that'll chill you to the bone. More cowboys died from freezing to death than from gunfights, stampedes, and Indian raids combined. Winter wasn't just harsh on the frontier. It was a serial killer that claimed thousands of lives every single year. And the men who survived did things that would seem impossible by today's standards. We're about to reveal sleeping techniques so effective and so brutal that some were considered too dangerous by trail bosses. Others saved lives in ways that sound like pure fiction. And one method was so extreme that the cowboys who used it were nicknamed the Walking Dead. But they lived when everyone else perished. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why these cowboys were the most indestructible human beings who ever lived on the American frontier. But I'm warning you now. Some of these survival methods will make you question everything you thought you knew about the limits of human endurance, the winter that changed everything. Before we dive into these shocking techniques, you need to understand what these men were facing. The winter of 1886 to 1887 wasn't just cold, it was apocalyptic. The prairies had been scorched from a brutal summer drought, so the cattle were already starving when the first snow fell in early November. Then, in January, a blizzard covered the Great Plains with 16 inches of snow, and temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero. This wasn't weather. This was a death sentence written across the sky. Entire herds of 10,000 cattle froze standing up, creating fields of ice-covered carcasses that stretched to the horizon. The prairie was littered with so many dead animals that they clogged rivers and spoiled drinking water for hundreds of miles. Ranchers who had built empires worth millions of dollars were wiped out overnight. They called it the Great Die-Up, and it marked the beginning of the end of the Wild West as America knew it. But here's what makes this story absolutely incredible. Cowboys were still working, cattle drives didn't stop, ranches needed tending, and men needed wages, no matter how many of them died trying to earn them. The cowboys who survived this winter did so because they had mastered something that separated them from every other group of people on Earth: the art of sleeping without shelter in conditions that killed everything else around them, the foundation of frontier survival. The cowboy bedroll wasn't just a blanket, it was a portable fortress, an engineering marvel that represented the difference between life and death on the American frontier. This system was the predecessor to every modern sleeping bag, but it was far more sophisticated than anything you can buy today. The foundation consisted of a massive waterproofed canvas tarpaulin, weighing 18 ounces per square yard and measuring between 6 by 14 feet and 7 by 18 feet. Think about that for a moment. These men were carrying what amounted to a heavy-duty truck tarp, treated with wax and oil to make it completely waterproof. The sheer size and weight of these bedrolls demonstrated just how seriously cowboys took the business of staying alive. Every pound they carried had to justify its presence through life-saving functionality. This wasn't camping gear. This was survival equipment built by men who understood that one mistake meant death. Inside that waterproof shell was a carefully engineered system of insulation. 3 or 4 thin quilts called sugans provided padding and warmth. 2 of these would be doubled over to create a barrier between the cowboy's body and the frozen ground. The remaining quilts went on top for additional warmth. In the center of this cocoon, wrapped in 1 or 2 wool blankets, The cowboy would position himself for the night. But here's where it gets truly ingenious. When packed up, this entire system was over a foot in diameter. That's not a sleeping bag. That's a portable bedroom designed to function in conditions that would kill you with inferior equipment. The large tarpaulin could act as both ground sheet and overhead cover, creating a completely enclosed environment when weather conditions demanded it. And here's the part that sounds impossible but actually worked. In snowy conditions, cowboys would actually welcome snow accumulation on their bedrolls. The extra weight made it warmer inside because the snow acted as additional insulation, creating what modern survivalists recognize as a snow cave effect. The accumulated snow formed an insulating barrier that trapped warm air while blocking the killing wind that could drop body temperature in minutes. Cowboys learned to embrace what would terrify most people. They understood that snow wasn't their enemy, wind was, and their bedroll system was specifically designed to defeat wind while using snow as an ally. The science of staying alive. The genius of the cowboy bedroll lay in its understanding of heat loss principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for decades. Cowboys had figured out through deadly trial and error that the human body loses heat in 4 ways. Conduction through contact with cold surfaces, convection through air movement across the skin, radiation through heat escaping into the cold air, and evaporation through moisture from breathing and sweating. Their bedroll system attacked each of these heat loss mechanisms with surgical precision. The doubled-over sugans created multiple air gaps that prevented conductive heat loss to the frozen ground. The large waterproof tarp eliminated convective heat loss by blocking wind. The enclosed space trapped radiated body heat, and the waterproof materials prevented evaporative cooling from moisture. But the real breakthrough was in the materials. Cowboys discovered that wool was the only fabric that could keep them alive in wet conditions. Unlike cotton or other natural fibers, wool retains its insulating properties even when damp. A cowboy could survive in a wet wool blanket, where he would die in a wet cotton one. This wasn't just preference. This was the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming a frozen corpse. The canvas tarpaulins were often treated with additional waterproofing agents, wax, oil, or other compounds that enhanced weather resistance. Cowboys understood that even small improvements in water repellency could mean the difference between life and death during extended exposure to harsh conditions. They were willing to carry extra weight and spend precious money on these treatments because they had seen what happened to men with inferior equipment. The systematic approach to bedroll construction reflected knowledge that was literally paid for in blood. Every design choice, every material selection, every construction technique had been tested under conditions where failure meant death. This wasn't theoretical engineering. This was survival technology developed by men who couldn't afford to get it wrong. The art of ground preparation. Setting up a bedroll wasn't just a matter of unrolling blankets and going to sleep. Cowboys developed elaborate ground preparation techniques that could mean the difference between waking up alive or not waking up at all. The first step was site selection, and this required reading the landscape like a book written in wind patterns and temperature zones. Cowboys avoided low-lying areas where cold air would pool and create deadly temperature drops during the night. They looked for spots with natural windbreaks, like rock outcroppings or stands of trees, but not so close that falling branches could crush them in their sleep. The ideal location was on slightly elevated ground with protection from prevailing winds, but good drainage to prevent water accumulation. Once they found the right spot, cowboys would clear the area of rocks, sticks, and other debris that could create pressure points or damage their bedroll. But here's where it gets interesting. They would sometimes deliberately create shallow depressions in the ground, using their boots or even buffalo bones as digging tools. These depressions served multiple purposes. First, they provided additional wind protection by getting the cowboy's body below ground level. Second, they created a more stable sleeping surface that wouldn't shift during the night. Third, and most importantly, they could be lined with additional insulating materials like dried grass, leaves, or even buffalo chips to create extra barrier against ground cold. The most experienced cowboys took ground preparation to an art form. They might spend an hour preparing their sleeping area, testing different positions, adjusting the ground contours, and even pre-positioning their bedroll materials to ensure maximum efficiency when the time came to set up in darkness or storm conditions. Some cowboys developed signature techniques that became legendary among their peers. There was the spiral method, where the bedroll was arranged in a slight spiral pattern that created natural air circulation while maintaining heat retention. The fortress technique involved using saddles, packs, and other equipment to create windbreaks around the bedroll. And the most extreme practitioners used what they called the burrow method, actually digging sleeping holes that provided complete protection from surface winds. The ritual of bedtime survival. Cowboys didn't just climb into their bedrolls and hope for the best. They developed elaborate bedtime rituals that were as much about survival as they were about comfort. These rituals began hours before actual sleep time and continued through carefully orchestrated steps designed to maximize body heat retention and minimize exposure to deadly cold. The first step was equipment preparation. Cowboys would bring their most essential gear into the bedroll with them. In wet weather, this meant hats, ropes, boots, and spurs. In cold weather, bridles joined the collection. This wasn't about convenience. Wet boots were nearly impossible to put on in freezing conditions. A wet rope became stiff and unmanageable. A cold bridle meant a cold bit that horses would fight against, potentially leaving a cowboy stranded. But the real genius was in the layering sequence. Cowboys would dress for sleep in a specific order designed to trap maximum body heat while maintaining the ability to move quickly if danger threatened. They might wear multiple layers of wool shirts, keeping their outer layers loose enough to maintain air circulation, but tight enough to prevent heat loss. The most experienced cowboys had developed what they called the Pullman berth technique, named after the railroad sleeping cars. They could dress and undress while remaining completely inside their warm bedroll, never exposing their bodies to the killing cold outside. This technique required practice and flexibility, but it could be the difference between maintaining body temperature and losing critical heat during the vulnerable transition periods. Some cowboys took this even further, developing methods to eat, drink, and even perform basic equipment maintenance while remaining in their bedrolls. They understood that every moment of exposure to extreme cold was a moment when hypothermia could begin its deadly work. The brotherhood of shared warmth. When conditions became truly life-threatening, cowboys employed techniques that required abandoning personal space and social conventions in favor of staying alive. The most common was called spooning, a practice borrowed from Civil War soldiers, where two or more men would share body heat by sleeping pressed together like stacked spoons. This wasn't about comfort or preference. This was about survival mathematics. Multiple bodies sharing a bedroll could create and maintain temperatures that would be impossible for a single person. The technique required careful coordination and rotation schedules to ensure that no one person bore the brunt of cold exposure while others stayed warm. The most effective spooning arrangements involved 3 men, with the coldest person positioned in the middle where they could benefit from heat from both sides. The outside men would rotate positions every few hours, ensuring that everyone shared the burden of exposure while maintaining group survival. Cowboys developed specific signals and communication methods for these rotations that could be executed in complete darkness without waking the entire group. But spooning was just the beginning of shared survival techniques. Cowboys also developed buddy systems for equipment monitoring, where partners would check each other for signs of frostbite or hypothermia during the night. They created group shelter arrangements where multiple bedrolls could be combined into larger protected areas. And in the most extreme conditions, they would huddle together under shared tarps, creating communal survival spaces that could keep entire crews alive when individual bedrolls might have failed. These weren't just survival techniques. They were the foundation of cowboy culture, creating bonds between men who had literally kept each other alive through the worst conditions nature could throw at them. The trust required to share body heat with another person in life or death conditions created relationships that lasted lifetimes. The transformation of desperation into science. What started as desperate attempts to avoid freezing to death gradually evolved into sophisticated understanding of cold weather survival that rivals anything modern science has developed. Cowboys began to recognize patterns in weather behavior, ground conditions, and equipment performance that allowed them to predict and prepare for deadly cold with remarkable accuracy. They learned to read wind patterns and temperature signs that could predict weather changes hours before they occurred. A sudden shift in wind direction might signal an incoming blizzard. Changes in how horses behaved could indicate dropping temperatures. Even the way snow fell or accumulated could provide crucial information about overnight conditions. This knowledge was passed down through informal networks of cowboys who shared techniques, modifications, and innovations that improved survival rates. A cowboy who developed a better way to waterproof canvas might share it with his crew. Someone who figured out a more effective way to arrange bedroll layers would demonstrate the technique around campfires. These informal knowledge-sharing sessions became the foundation for continuous improvement in survival technology. The most successful cowboys became legendary for their ability to sleep comfortably in conditions that would kill less prepared men. They developed personal techniques and equipment modifications that were closely guarded secrets, passed on only to trusted friends or crew members. Some of these techniques were so effective that they seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed them. But the real breakthrough was the recognition that sleeping warm wasn't just about having good equipment. It was about understanding the relationship between the human body, the immediate environment, and the broader weather systems that could turn a survivable night into a death trap. Cowboys who mastered this understanding could literally sleep warm in conditions that would freeze less knowledgeable men solid. The hidden dangers that killed the unprepared. But surviving a night in the wilderness wasn't just about staying warm. Cowboys faced a maze of deadly threats that could turn even the best bedroll into a frozen tomb. Hypothermia was just one killer stalking the frontier darkness. There was also what cowboys called the silent death, carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated warming fires built too close to bedrolls. Many greenhorn cowboys made the fatal mistake of building fires inside or directly adjacent to their sleeping areas, thinking the warmth would keep them alive through brutal nights. What they didn't understand was that incomplete combustion in low oxygen environments created invisible clouds of carbon monoxide that would put men into deeper and deeper sleep until they never woke up. Experienced cowboys found entire camps of frozen men who had died with smiles on their faces, poisoned by the very fires they thought would save them. Then there was the paradox of wet death in dry country. Cowboys could die from exposure to moisture even in desert conditions. Sweat trapped inside bedrolls during setup could freeze against their skin during temperature drops, creating ice sheets that would suck body heat away faster than naked exposure to cold air. The most experienced cowboys developed elaborate techniques for managing moisture inside their sleeping systems. Using ventilation methods and material arrangements that seemed counterintuitive but proved deadly effective. Frostbite presented another layer of complexity that could cripple or kill even well-prepared men. Cowboys learned to recognize the early stages of tissue freezing, the tingling and numbness that preceded permanent damage. But recognition wasn't enough. They developed field treatment methods using body heat, friction, and gradual rewarming techniques that could save fingers and toes that less knowledgeable men would lose to amputation or gangrene. The most insidious danger was what cowboys called the warm death. Men who became too comfortable in their bedrolls during moderate cold could be caught completely unprepared when temperatures plummeted during the night. Their bodies would adapt to the initial conditions, lowering metabolic heat production just as environmental conditions became lethal. By the time they realized the danger, their bodies would lack the energy reserves needed to generate survival heat. Cowboys who understood these hidden dangers developed what amounted to sleep discipline, maintaining constant awareness of their body temperature, breathing patterns, and environmental conditions even while resting. They learned to wake themselves at regular intervals to assess conditions and make adjustments to their sleeping systems. This wasn't restful sleep by modern standards, but it was the kind of vigilant rest that kept men alive when complete unconsciousness would have killed them. the equipment innovations that saved lives. As cowboys gained experience with frontier sleeping conditions, they began modifying their equipment in ways that pushed the boundaries of survival technology. The standard bedroll design was just the starting point for innovations that turned basic gear into life-saving systems that seemed almost magical to those who didn't understand the principles involved. One of the most effective modifications was the heat stone system. Cowboys would select specific types of rocks, heat them in campfires for hours, then wrap them in cloth and position them strategically inside their bedrolls. But this wasn't as simple as throwing hot rocks into blankets. The wrong type of stone could explode from thermal shock, sending red-hot fragments into bedding and flesh. Porous stones could build up steam pressure and detonate like grenades. Successful heat stone practitioners developed an almost scientific understanding of geology, learning to identify rocks with the right density and composition to hold heat safely through long nights. They understood thermal mass calculations that wouldn't be formalized by engineers for decades, knowing exactly how much heat capacity different sized stones would provide and how long that heat would last under various insulation conditions. The placement of heat stones required surgical precision. Too close to the body, and they could cause burns or overheating. Too far away, and they provided no benefit. Cowboys learned to create heat gradients inside their bedrolls, positioning stones to provide warmth zones that would maintain comfortable temperatures for 8 to 10 hours while avoiding dangerous hotspots that could damage equipment or flesh. Some cowboys developed heat stone rotation systems, where multiple stones were prepared and exchanged during the night to maintain consistent warmth. This required waking at precise intervals and performing complex manipulations inside the bedroll without losing significant body heat. The most accomplished practitioners could execute complete stone exchanges in under 2 minutes, while remaining mostly covered and warm. Beyond heat stones, cowboys innovated with air circulation systems that seemed to violate common sense, but proved remarkably effective. They learned to create controlled ventilation inside their bedrolls that prevented carbon dioxide buildup and moisture accumulation while maintaining heat retention. This involved strategic placement of small openings and air channels that allowed fresh air circulation without creating drafts that would steal body heat. The chemistry of frontier survival. Cowboys also discovered that survival wasn't just about equipment and technique. It was about understanding how the human body generated and conserved heat under extreme stress conditions. They learned to manipulate their own metabolism through food timing, breathing techniques, and physical conditioning methods that modern sports science is only beginning to understand. The most experienced cowboys would begin preparing their bodies for cold exposure hours before bedtime. They developed eating schedules that maximized caloric heat production during the coldest parts of the night. Certain foods, particularly those high in fats and proteins, would generate internal heat through digestion processes that could provide crucial warmth during temperature drops. But food timing was just part of metabolic manipulation. Cowboys learned breathing techniques that could increase oxygen circulation and heat generation throughout their bodies. These weren't meditation practices. They were practical methods for boosting internal heat production when external warming wasn't sufficient for survival. Some cowboys practiced what they called controlled shivering, deliberately triggering muscle contractions that would generate heat while avoiding the energy depletion that came with uncontrolled shivering fits. They learned to pace these heat generation bursts to conserve energy while maintaining body temperature above critical thresholds. The most advanced practitioners developed methods for controlling blood circulation to extremities, using muscle tension and positioning techniques that could prevent frostbite in fingers and toes, even during extreme exposure. These techniques required understanding of human anatomy and circulation that was far ahead of frontier medical knowledge. Cowboys also learned to recognize and manipulate the early stages of hypothermia, using the body's own heat generation responses to maintain consciousness and motor function when less prepared men would have succumbed to cold-induced stupor. They understood that hypothermia wasn't just about temperature. It was about maintaining mental alertness and physical coordination that could mean the difference between making survival decisions and becoming another frontier casualty. The psychological warfare against winter death. Surviving deadly cold wasn't just about physical preparation. It was about mental conditioning, that could overcome the psychological effects of extreme environmental stress. Cowboys developed mental techniques that modern military survival training still struggles to match. Methods for maintaining morale and decision-making ability when cold exposure began affecting brain function. The most dangerous aspect of cold weather survival was the way hypothermia affected judgment and reasoning. Men would make increasingly poor decisions as their core body temperature dropped, often abandoning effective survival techniques just when they needed them most. Cowboys learned to recognize these mental changes in themselves and their companions, developing systems for maintaining rational thinking, even as cold began shutting down higher brain functions. They created mental checklists and decision trees that could be followed even when complex reasoning became impossible. Simple, memorized procedures for equipment adjustment, heat generation, and emergency response that could be executed automatically when conscious thought became unreliable. Cowboys also developed methods for maintaining hope and fighting spirit during the darkest and coldest parts of long winter nights. They learned to break survival time into manageable segments, focusing on getting through the next hour rather than contemplating entire nights of exposure. This psychological segmentation prevented the despair that could lead to giving up when continuation might have meant survival. The most successful cowboys developed what they called cold weather personalities, mental states that were specifically adapted to extreme survival conditions. These weren't just tough attitudes. They were comprehensive psychological adaptations that included modified risk assessment, altered pain tolerance, and enhanced focus on immediate survival priorities over long-term comfort or convenience. These mental techniques were often more closely guarded than equipment modifications or technical knowledge. Cowboys understood that psychological preparation was the foundation that made all other survival techniques possible. Without the right mental approach, even perfect equipment and extensive knowledge could fail when conditions became truly life-threatening. The legacy of winter survival masters. The cowboys who mastered these sleeping techniques became legendary figures on the frontier, men whose reputations were built not just on their to handle cattle or horses, but on their seemingly supernatural ability to survive conditions that killed other men. These winter survival masters developed techniques so advanced that they seemed to operate by different rules than ordinary human beings. Some became known for their ability to sleep comfortably in temperatures that would put less prepared men into life, threatening hypothermia within hours. They could set up effective sleeping systems in complete darkness during blizzard conditions, work with equipment that other men couldn't even touch without frostbite, and maintain physical and mental performance levels that defied explanation. The techniques developed by these survival masters began to spread throughout cowboy culture, passed down through informal teaching networks and demonstrated around campfires during cattle drives and roundups. But the most advanced methods remained closely guarded secrets, shared only with trusted companions or passed down through mentor relationships that could take years to develop. These weren't just survival techniques. They were the foundation of a way of life that allowed human beings to thrive in environmental conditions that should have been impossible to survive. The cowboys who mastered winter sleeping didn't just endure the frontier, they conquered it, turning deadly cold from an enemy into a manageable challenge that could be overcome through knowledge, preparation, and the kind of determination that defined the American frontier spirit. But the most remarkable aspect of these survival masters wasn't their individual techniques or personal resilience. It was their understanding that frontier survival was ultimately about community knowledge and shared responsibility for keeping everyone alive through conditions that would have defeated any individual effort. The evolution of cowboy cold weather tactics didn't stop at individual survival. As word spread about the most effective techniques, entire cattle crews began developing coordinated systems that transformed winter survival from desperate individual struggles into organized group operations. Trail bosses, who understood these principles, could keep entire outfits alive through conditions that would have wiped out less prepared crews. The most successful outfits developed what they called the rotation system, where cowboys would take turns maintaining fires, monitoring weather conditions, and checking on their companions throughout the night. This wasn't just about sharing workloads. It was about creating redundant safety systems where multiple people were responsible for group survival at all times. Cowboys learned to position their bedrolls in specific patterns that maximize shared warmth while maintaining individual space and mobility. The wagon wheel formation placed bedrolls in a circle around a central fire area, allowing heat distribution while enabling quick response to emergencies. The line formations stretched bedrolls in rows that created windbreaks and allowed for easy communication during storms. But the most advanced crews developed the cellular system, where groups of 3 or 4 cowboys' weather conditions separated the larger group. Each cell had designated responsibilities for would cluster their bedrolls together, creating multiple survival cells that could function independently if equipment, fire maintenance, and emergency response that ensured no critical function would be lost if individual cowboys became incapacitated. The most experienced trail bosses could read weather patterns and crew conditions to predict which cowboys were most at risk during particular nights. They would assign stronger, more experienced men to partner with those who showed signs of cold vulnerability, creating buddy systems that went far beyond simple companionship to become literal life support networks. These coordinated survival systems required discipline and training that most modern organizations would struggle to implement. Cowboys had to subordinate personal comfort and preferences to group survival needs, following procedures and protocols that could mean the difference between bringing everyone home alive or losing men to conditions that proper coordination could have prevented. The unsung heroes of frontier warmth. While history remembers the famous gunfighters and cattle barons, the real heroes of frontier survival were often the chuck wagon cooks and camp tenders who developed the support systems that kept cowboy crews alive through deadly winters. These men weren't just preparing meals. They were operating mobile survival laboratories that could mean the difference between life and death for entire consuming excessive fuel or creating dangerous smoke conditions. They learned to position wag outfits, chuck wagon cooks became masters of heat management, developing techniques for maintaining cooking fires that could provide warmth and light throughout long winter nights without ons and equipment, to create wind barriers and heat reflection zones that extended the warming effects of their fires across much larger areas. The most skilled cooks developed what they called the heat corridors of warmth that cowboys could move through while performing chain system, using multiple fire positions and heated equipment to create necessary tasks during extreme cold. Metal cooking equipment would be heated and positioned strategically to provide hand and body warming stations that could prevent frostbite during essential work. But perhaps most importantly, these support specialists understood nutrition in ways that kept cowboys' internal heat generation functioning effectively throughout extended cold exposure. They learned which foods would provide sustained energy for heat production, which combinations would maximize caloric efficiency, and how to time meals to maintain metabolic heat generation during the coldest parts of the night. Cookie Williams, a legendary chuck wagon cook whose reputation for keeping crews alive through conditions that worked the northern ranges for 15 winters, developed admen working with less skilled support. His secret wasn't just cooking ability, it was understanding how to coordinate food, fire, and shelter systems to create survival environments that could function. Relid cooks like him also served as informal medical officers, ably in extreme conditions. Williams Ann, learning to recognize and treat the early stages of hypothermia, frostbite, and other cold-related injuries that could disable or kill cowboys if not addressed quickly. They carried crude but effective medical supplies and new field treatment techniques that could save limbs and lives when professional medical help was hundreds of miles away. The dark side of winter survival mastery. But mastering frontier cold weather survival came with a price that went far beyond physical discomfort or equipment costs. The psychological toll of repeated exposure to life-threatening conditions created a class of men who were fundamentally changed by their experiences with winter survival. Cowboys who had survived multiple deadly winters often developed what modern psychology would recognize as hypervigilance and anxiety disorders. They became unable to fully relax even in safe conditions, constantly monitoring weather patterns, temperature changes, and equipment status with an intensity that exhausted those around them. Some winter survival veterans became obsessively protective of their equipment and techniques, hoarding supplies and refusing to share knowledge that could have saved other men's lives. The trauma of watching companions freeze to death create the trust relationships that effective group survival required psychological barriers that prevented some experienced cowboys from forming. Others went in the opposite direction. Becoming our men would take unnecessary risks, sleep in inadequate shelter, recklessly confident in their ability to survive conditions that should have killed them. These, or venture out during weather conditions that more cautious cowboys would avoid. Their survival success bred a kind of invincibility complex that eventually proved fatal when they encountered conditions that exceeded even their advanced capabilities. The most tragic cases were cowboys who developed what camp-repeated exposure to survival stress created permanent changes in personality and reasoning. Doctors called winter madness, a condition where they'd become irrational, aggressive, or completely withdrawn when ability. These men might function normally during moderate weather, but would cold conditions triggered memories of previous survival trauma. But perhaps the most profound change was in how these survival masters related to other people and to civilization itself. Men who had learned to depend entirely on their own resources and techniques life, where survival depended on cooperation, compromise often found it impossible to readjust to settle, and social institutions rather than individual knowledge and preparation. The technological revolution that ended an era. The cowboys' mastery of cold weather sleeping techniques represented the peak of human adaptation to extreme environmental conditions using only natural materials and human ingenuity. But this remarkable survival knowledge was destined to become obsolete as technological and social changes transformed the American frontier. The arrival of the railroad changed everything about cattle operations and cowboy life. Cattle drives that had required weeks or months of outdoor survival could be completed in days using train transport. Cowboys who had needed to master winter sleeping techniques for long-range operations found themselves working closer to towns and settlements, where heated buildings provided alternatives to frontier. Improved manufacturing and transportation made survival methods at reasonable costs better equipment available. Factory-produced blankets, waterproof materials, made gear that cowboys had relied on for survival, and insulated clothing began replacing the improvised and hand. While these new materials were often superior, also meant that the knowledge required to create in terms of warmth and durability, the ensing of the open range eliminated much of the long effective survival systems from basic materials began to disappear. The F-distance outdoor work that had required advanced survival skills returned to bunkhouses. Cowboys working on enclosed ranches could the need for techniques that had been essential and heated buildings at the end of each day, removing for survival just decades earlier. But perhaps most significantly, the social changes that accompanied the closing of the frontier meant that the kind of men no longer needed or valued in the same who had mastered winter survival techniques were way. The skills that had made them legendary on the frontier often made them poorly adapted to settled life in an increasingly organized and regulated society. The scientific validation of cowboy techniques. Modern cold weather research has confirmed that many cowboy survival techniques were based on sound scientific principles, even though the cowboys who developed them had no formal understanding of the physics and physiology involved. Military survival specialists studying historical frontier techniques have been amazed by the sophistication and effectiveness of methods that were developed through pure trial and error experience. The layered insulation systems that cowboys used in their bedrolls incorporated principles of thermal dynamics that weren't century. The way they managed air circulation, moisture control, and heat retention demonstrated intuitive understanding of concepts formerly understood by engineers until the 20th, that modern outdoor gear manufacturers spend millions of dollars researching and developing. Cowboy techniques for reading weather patterns and predicting temperature changes have proven to be remarkably accurate when tested against modern meteorological methods. The optimal protection from wind and cold showed understanding of microclimate effects. Their ability to select campsites that provide that contemporary camping guides are still trying to explain to outdoor enthusiasts. Perhaps most impressively, the psychological techniques that cowboys use to maintain mental function and decision-making ability during extreme cold exposure incorporated methods that military survival training programs have adopted for modern special operations personnel. The mental conditioning and stress management approaches developed by frontier cowboys remain relevant for anyone facing extreme survival conditions. But modern research has also revealed why some cowboy techniques were so dangerous and why survival rates remained relatively low despite advanced knowledge and equipment. The margin for error in frontier survival conditions was so narrow that even small mistakes or equipment failures could prove fatal, regardless of how sophisticated the overall survival system might be. The mysterious disappearance of survival masters. As the frontier era ended and cowboy culture evolved into ranch work and rodeo entertainment, many of the most advanced winter survival techniques simply vanished. The men who had mastered these methods took their knowledge with them to graves scattered across the West, and the specific details of their most effective techniques were lost forever. Some of this knowledge disappearance was intentional. Cowboys who had developed superior survival techniques often guarded them as trade secrets that gave them competitive advantages in finding work and surviving conditions that defeated other men. When the economic value of these skills disappeared, so did the incentive to pass them down to younger generations. Other knowledge was lost because it was never written down or formally documented. Cowboy survival techniques were learned through apprenticeship and hands-on experience rather than books or formal instruction. When the social networks that supported this kind of knowledge transfer broke down, the information simply disappeared. But perhaps most tragically, some knowledge was deliberately suppressed because it was considered too dangerous for general use. Techniques that could keep experienced cowboys alive in extreme conditions could to use them without proper training and understanding, rather also kill inexperienced men who attempt than risk tragic accidents. Some survival masters chose to take their most advanced knowledge to their graves. The result is that modern researchers and outdoor enthusiasts are left with incomplete pictures of what were probably the most advanced cold weather survival systems ever developed using natural materials and human resources alone. We know that these techniques existed and were remarkably effective, but the specific details of how they worked remain tantalizingly out of reach. The enduring mystery of cowboy endurance. Even with modern understanding of cold weather physiology and survival principles, researchers struggle to explain how cowboys were able to maintain physical and mental performance levels that seem impossible by contemporary standards. The combination of techniques, equipment, and psychological conditioning that allowed these men to thrive in deadly conditions represents a peak of human environmental adaptation that may never be fully understood or replicated. Part of the mystery lies in the selection process that determined which men became successful frontier cowboys. The work naturally filtered out those who lacked the physical resilience, mental toughness, or technical aptitude required for survival in extreme conditions. Only those who possessed unusual combinations of strength, intelligence, and determination could survive long enough to develop advanced survival skills. But selection alone doesn't explain the remarkable capabilities that the best winter survival practitioners demonstrated. These men seem to operate according to different physiological and psychological rules than ordinary people, maintaining function and performance in conditions that would incapacitate or kill others with similar backgrounds and training. Modern sports science and military research have identified some of the factors that might have contributed to exceptional cold weather performance. Acclimatization effects from repeated exposure to extreme conditions can create physiological adaptations that improve cold tolerance. Mental conditioning techniques can enhance pain tolerance and decision-making ability under stress. Nutritional knowledge can optimize metabolic heat production and energy conservation. But even of the best cowboy winter survival specialists suggests accounting for all known factors, the documented performance capabilities that exceed what current scientific understanding would predict as possible. These men represent a unique combination of genetic beings who were literally adapted for survival in conditions that defeat potential, environmental conditioning, and cultural knowledge that created human modern people equipped with vastly superior technology. The cultural transformation of survival wisdom. As cowboy culture evolved from practical frontier survival into romanticized entertainment and mythology, The real knowledge and techniques that had made cowboys legendary were gradually replaced with simplified and often inaccurate versions that bore little resemblance to actual frontier practices. Hollywood movies and popular literature created images of cowboys that emphasized gunfighting, cattle rustling, and romantic adventure, while largely ignoring the sophisticated survival knowledge that was the real foundation of cowboy success. The bedroll became a simple blanket roll rather than the complex survival system it actually was. Winter survival techniques were reduced to building campfires and wearing heavy coats, rather than the elaborate systems of equipment, technique, and mental conditioning that actually kept men alive. This cultural transformation meant that even as interest in cowboy history and frontier life remained high, the specific knowledge that had made cowboys successful was gradually forgotten and replaced with mythology that was more entertaining but far less useful for understanding how these remarkable men actually lived and survived. Modern outdoor enthusiasts and survival specialists have had to work backwards from incomplete historical records and archaeological evidence to reconstruct techniques that were once common knowledge among working cowboys. The irony is that people today who are interested in learning frontier survival skills often know more about the theoretical principles involved than the practical details of how to actually apply them in real wilderness conditions. The legacy of this cultural transformation is that cowboy winter survival techniques remain more myth than documented fact, with researchers still debating which historical accounts are accurate and which have weather survival represented one of the most remarkable examples of human environmental adaptation in these limitations. Enough evidence remains to confirm that cowboy coal been distorted by decades of romantic storytelling and cultural interpretation. But despite recorded history, the men who mastered these techniques achieved something that modern technology and scientific understanding still struggle to match: the ability to sleep warm and wake up alive in conditions that should have killed them, using nothing but natural materials, human ingenuity, and the kind of determination that defined the American frontier spirit. The techniques they developed, the knowledge they accumulated, and the legends they created continue to inspire and challenge anyone who faces the eternal human struggle against beings are capable of remarkable adaptation and survival when the stakes the cold darkness of winter nights. Their story reminds us that humans are high enough, and the determination is strong enough to refuse defeat, even when defeat seems inevitable and death appears to be the only logical outcome. These cowboys didn't just survive impossible conditions, they transformed survival into an art form, creating techniques so effective and so perfectly adapted to their environment that they seemed to possess almost supernatural powers. The reality was far more impressive than any supernatural explanation could be. They were ordinary men who developed extraordinary capabilities through necessity, experience, and the absolute refusal to accept that deadly cold would determine their fate. Their methods went far beyond what most people could imagine or stomach. The Winter Masters developed what they called the grease system, a technique so revolting and effective that it separated the true survivors from those who would rather freeze than compromise their dignity. Cowboys would collect animal fat from buffalo, bears, or any large game they could find, then render it down into a thick, waterproof coating that they would smear over light application. We're talking about a complete their entire bodies before sleep. This wasn't just a coating from head to toe, thick enough to create a waterproof barrier against moisture, while providing an additional layer of insulation that could mean the difference between maintaining core body temperature and slipping into deadly hypothermia. The smell was nauseating, the texture was revolting, and the social implications were humiliating. But it worked. Cowboys who mastered the grease system could sleep in conditions that would kill unprotected men within hours. The animal fat created a microenvironment around their skin that trapped body heat while repelling external moisture. It was like wearing a biological wetsuit that functioned in air instead of water. The most experienced practitioners learned to mix different types of fat with specific ratios of pine resin, tree sap, and other natural materials to create custom formulations that provided optimal protection for their individual body chemistry and local environmental conditions. But here's the part that sounds impossible until you understand the science behind it. Cowboys who used the grease system effectively could maintain normal body temperature in sub-zero conditions while wearing minimal clothing. Their bodies became so efficient at heat retention that they could actually overheat in moderate cold that would chill unprotected men. They had essentially turned their skin into the most advanced insulation system available on the frontier. The technique required precise application and timing. Too much grease and they would suffocate from blocked pores. Too little and they would get no benefit while still enduring the social and practical costs of coating themselves in animal fat. The most skilled practitioners could apply the grease coating in complete darkness and have it perfectly distributed within minutes. The ritual of winter warriors. Cowboys who had mastered multiple survival systems developed elaborate pre-sleep rituals that combined all their techniques into coordinated survival performances that seemed almost magical to those who witnessed them. These weren't just practical preparations. They were carefully choreographed sequences of actions that had been refined through deadly experience into precise routines that maximize survival chances while minimizing energy expenditure and exposure time. The ritual would begin hours before actual sleep time with equipment preparation and site assessment. The cowboy would scout multiple potential sleeping locations, testing wind patterns, drainage, and ground conditions before selecting the optimal spot for bedroll placement. This wasn't casual site selection. It was systematic environmental analysis that took into account factors that could change throughout the night as weather conditions evolved. Next came the equipment staging phase, where every piece of survival period when exposure to cold could quickly gear would be positioned for maximum efficiency during the critical setup become dangerous. Bedroll components would be arranged in specific sequences that allowed for rapid deployment, even in complete darkness or storm conditions. Heat stones would be selected, tested, and prepared for heating. Additional materials like dried grass, animal hair, or other insulation supplements would be gathered and staged for use. The personal preparation phase involved the physical and mental conditioning necessary for optimal survival performance. Cowboys would perform specific exercises designed to boost circulation and heat generation before exposure to sleeping conditions. They would consume carefully planned combinations of food and liquid that would provide sustained energy for internal heat production throughout the night. And they would engage in mental preparation techniques that condition their minds for the vigilant rest required for survival in extreme conditions. But the most remarkable aspect of these pre-sleep rituals was the way they integrated multiple, the most challenging conditions. A master winter cowboy could complete survival systems into seamless performances that could be executed under his entire setup routine in under 15 minutes, even during blizzard conditions, emerging from the process with a sleeping system that could keep him alive and comfortable in temperatures that would kill unprepared men. The forbidden techniques that trail bosses banned. Some cowboy survival methods were so extreme and dangerous that experienced trail bosses would prohibit their use, even when they were proven to be effective for individual survival. These banned techniques usually involved practices that could endanger the entire crew operations. The firebed technique was shallow pits and fill them with burning or required resources that weren't sustainable for group coals. Then cover the one of the most controversial. Cowboys would dig their bedrolls over the buried heat source. When executed perfectly with a thin layer of dirt and position, this created a heated sleeping surface that could maintain warmth for and underground furnaces that could burn sleeping entire night. When executed imperfectly, it creates cowboys alive. The technique required precise calculation to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning, ore of coal quantity, dirt thickness, and vent small errors in any of these calculations could result in death by burning, thermal burns. Cowboys had to understand combustion rates, heat transfer principles, and soil insulation properties to use firebeds safely, evacuation or carbon monoxide poisoning. Trail bosses banned firebeds, not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well for individual survival while creating unacceptable risks for group operations. A firebed that got out of control could ignite, carbon monoxide from impite grass fires that would endanger the entire cattle. Properly ventilated firebeds could poison multiple cowboys sleeping in close proximity. And the resources required to build effective firebeds could deplete fuel supplies needed for cooking fires and other essential camp functions. But the cowboys who mastered firebed techniques in defiance of official prohibitions became legendary for their ability to sleep warm in the most extreme conditions. They developed methods for calculating heat requirements, managing combustion rates, and controlling dangerous emissions that bordered on primitive engineering. These men could create heated sleeping areas that maintained optimal temperatures for 8 to 10 hours, while avoiding the deadly mistakes that killed less skilled practitioners. The alcohol furnace method was another banned technique that some cowboys used despite official disapproval and significant personal risk. This involved the consumption of precise random drinking. It was calculated metabolic manipulation amounts of high-proof alcohol at carefully timed intervals to maintain internal heat generation throughout the night. But this wasn't that required understanding of alcohol's effects on circulation, heat production, and hypothermia resistance. Cowboys had to calculate their body weight who used the alcohol furnace method, alcohol tolerance, environmental temperature, and expected exposure duration to determine the exact amount and timing of alcohol consumption needed for survival benefit without lethal intoxication. Too little alcohol provided no survival benefit. Too much alcohol accelerated heat loss through vasodilation and impaired the decision-making ability needed for other survival techniques. The most skilled practitioners could maintain their core body temperature through alcohol-induced heat generation while retaining full mental function and physical coordination. They understood that alcohol's warming effect was temporary and had to be carefully managed to avoid the dangerous rebound cooling that occurred as alcohol metabolized and blood vessels constricted. Trail and established patterns of alcohol dependence that could destroy bosses banned the alcohol furnace method because it required access to supplies that were expensive and limited, created risks of intoxication that could endanger entire crews. Evolution of emergency protocols. As cow, the technique wasn't necessary for survival. The cowboys' effectiveness during moderate weather conditions when developing standardized emergency protocols that could buoy survival knowledge accumulated and spread throughout frontier culture. Informal networks began handle extreme conditions. These protocols represented collective survival wisdom that won't be implemented when individual survival techniques weren't sufficient to far beyond individual skills to encompass coordinated group responses to life-threatening situations. The distress signal system was one of the most sophisticated emergency protocols that cowboys developed. Using combinations of smoke signals, fire arrangements, and equipment positioning, cowboys could communicate specific types of emergency situations to other riders or camps across distances of emergency, while a different fire arrangement could signal equipment several miles. A particular smoke pattern might indicate hypoth. But these weren't just communication failure or injury that required immediate assistance methods. They were comprehensive emergency response systems that included standardized procedures for rescue operations, medical treatment, and resource sharing during survival crises. Cowboys who spotted emergency signals knew exactly what type of help was needed and how to organize appropriate responses without wasting time on communication or coordination. The buddy rotation protocol was another emergency system that could save lives when individual survival techniques weren't sufficient. Cowboys working in pairs or small groups would establish rotation schedules for monitoring each other's condition throughout dangerous nights. These rotations included specific procedures for checking body temperature, mental alertness, equipment function, and environmental conditions at regular intervals. If a cowboy showed signs of hypothermia, frostbite, or other cold-related emergencies, his buddy would implement standardized treatment protocols that could stabilize the condition and prevent deterioration until more comprehensive help could be arranged. These protocols included techniques for rewarming hypothermic individuals, treating frostbite, and maintaining circulation in extremities that were beginning to freeze. The resource pooling protocol allowed cowboys to combine their individual survival resources when extreme conditions exceeded what any single person could handle. Bedroll materials, pooling food resources for a loan. This might involve sharing body heat, combining metabolic heat generation, or coordinating equipment to create group shelter systems that were perhaps most importantly. These emergency protocols included procedures more effective than individual setups, but for making life or death decisions about when to abandon failed survival attempts and seek alternative solutions. Cowboys learned to recognize when their current survival strategies weren't working and needed to be changed before the situation became irreversible. This kind of adaptive decision-making under extreme stress required training and mental conditioning that went far beyond individual survival skills. The medical mysteries of cold adaptation. Cowboys who survived multiple severe winters developed physiological changes that modern medicine still doesn't fully understand. These weren't just improvements in cold tolerance or mental toughness. They were fundamental alterations in how their bodies generated heat, conserved energy, and maintained function under extreme environmental stress. Veteran winter cowboys often developed what appeared to be enhanced circulation systems that could maintain blood flow to extremities, even during severe cold exposure. Their hands and feet would remain functional at temperatures that would cause immediate frostbite in less adapted individuals. Some could work with bare hands in sub-zero conditions for extended periods without apparent discomfort or tissue damage. Their metabolic systems also seemed to adapt in ways that allowed more efficient heat generation from food consumption. Cowboys who had mastered winter survival could maintain body temperature on fewer calories than would be expected, while also generating more internal heat from the same nutritional inputs. This wasn't just about better nutrition or food choices. It appeared to be fundamental changes in how their bodies processed energy for heat production. Perhaps most remarkably, experienced winter cowboys developed enhanced pain tolerance and mental function under cold stress that allowed them to maintain decision-making ability and physical coordination, even when experiencing conditions that would incapacitate most people. They could think clearly and perform complex tasks while enduring cold exposure that would cause confusion, disorientation, and loss of motor. Veterans also developed what appeared to be enhanced sense control in less adapted individuals. Some winter-ori abilities that allowed them to detect weather changes, temperature variations, and environmental threats with remarkable accuracy. They could predict temperature drops hours before they occurred, sense dangerous wind shifts that might indicate incoming storms, and identify subtle environmental cues that warned of changing survival conditions. But these adaptations came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. Cowboys who had undergone extreme cold adaptation often found it difficult to function normally in warm conditions. Their enhanced circulation systems could cause overheating in moderate temperatures. Their metabolic adaptations could make it difficult to maintain proper nutrition when high-calorie survival foods weren't necessary. And their heightened environmental awareness could become exhausting psychological hypervigilance when survival wasn't immediately threatened. Modern researchers studying historical accounts of cowboy cold adaptation have found parallels with extreme environment adaptations documented in other populations. But the combination and intensity of changes described in frontier accounts suggest levels of human environmental adaptation that may represent the absolute limits of what's possible through natural acclimatization processes. The technology that cowboys invented. Out of desperate necessity, cowboys developed tools and techniques that were decades ahead of anything available through commercial manufacturing. These weren't just modifications of existing equipment. They were completely original inventions that solved survival problems in ways that wouldn't be duplicated by professional designers until well into the 20th century. The heat battery system was one of the most ingenious inventions that emerged from cowboy survival innovation. Cowboys learned to create thermal storage devices using combinations of metal, stone, and organic materials that could absorb heat from fires and release it slowly over extended periods. These devices were far more sophisticated than simple heated stones. The most advanced heat batteries involved metal containers filled with specific combinations of materials that had different thermal absorption and release characteristics. Cowboys would layer materials like sand, clay, metal fragments, and organic matter in precise ratios that optimized heat storage capacity while controlling release rates. The result was portable heating devices that could maintain consistent warmth for 10 to 12 hours from a single heating session. Cowboys also invented ventilation systems for their bedrolls that managed air circulation in ways that prevented carbon dioxide buildup and moisture accumulation while maintaining heat retention. These systems used principles of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics that weren't formally understood by engineers until decades later. The ventilation systems controls that created controlled airflow patterns inside the bedroll environment involved carefully positioned openings, internal air channels, and circulation. Cowboys could adjust these systems to account for wind conditions, temperature variations sacrificing thermal efficiency, but perhaps the most remarkable, and individual breathing patterns to maintain optimal air quality without automatically adjust its insulating properties based on external cowboy invention, was the adaptive insulation system that could withstand temperature conditions. This involved layered materials that expanded or contracted in response to temperature changes, creating more or less insulation as conditions required. Cowboys discovered mineral substances that would change their thermal properties in response to temperatured combinations of natural materials, animal hair, plant fibers, and even variations. These materials would provide maximum insulation during maintaining optimal comfort. The psychological techniques that saved sannulating effect when temperatures moderated, preventing overheating while the coldest conditions but would automatically reduce their intensity. Surviving repeated exposure to life-threatening oafness or determination. Cowboys developed sophisticated psychological methods. Cold conditions required mental conditioning techniques that went far beyond simple tea for maintaining mental health and decision-making ability during extended periods of extreme environmental stress. The segmentation technique was one of the most effective mental survival methods. Instead of contemplating entire nights of cold exposure, cowboys learned to break survival time into manageable segments that could be endured one at a time. This might involve focusing only on the next hour, the next temperature check, or the next equipment adjustment rather than thinking about the total duration of cold exposure. This psychological segmentation prevented the despair and panic that could lead to poor survival decisions or complete abandonment of effective techniques. Cowboys who even during conditions that seemed endless and hopeless, toted segmentation, could maintain hope and rational thinking, less mentally prepared individuals. The visualization technique involved creating detailed mental scenarios of successful survival outcomes that could be reviewed and reinforced during the most difficult parts of cold exposure. Cowboys would develop elaborate mental pictures of waking up warm and comfortable, completing their work successfully, and returning home safely to motivate continued effort during times when giving up seemed like the only rational option. But visualization wasn't just about positive thinking. Cowboys learned to create realistic mental rehearsals of survival procedures that could be executed even when cold exposure began affecting their cognitive abilities. They would practice complex equipment manipulations, emergency procedures, and decision be performed automatically when conscious thought became unreliable. The acceptance-making processes in their minds until these procedures could technique involved learning to embrace rather than fight the discomfort and fear associated with extreme cold exposure. Cowboys discovered that resistance to cold conditions often made survival more difficult by creating additional stress and energy expenditure that reduced their overall survival capacity. Instead of fighting cold conditions, master winter cowboys learned to accept discomfort as a normal part of their survival process, while maintaining focus on the techniques and procedures that would keep them alive. This mental acceptance reduced the psychological stress that could impair decision-making and allowed them to direct all their mental energy toward effective survival responses. The detachment technique allowed cowboys to maintain objective assessment of their survival situation, even when fear, discomfort, or cold-induced mental changes began affecting their judgment. They learned to observe their own physical and mental condition as if they were outside observers, maintaining the analytical thinking necessary for effective survival decisions. Cowboys who mastered detachment could recognize the early stages of hypothermia in themselves, assess the effectiveness of their survival techniques objectively, and make rational adjustments to their procedures even when emotional responses or cold-induced mental changes were pushing them toward panic or poor decisions. The legacy of impossible endurance. The winter survival techniques developed by frontier cowboys represent one of the most remarkable examples of human environmental adaptation in recorded history. These men didn't just survive conditions that should have killed them. They developed comprehensive systems of knowledge, equipment, and psychological conditioning that allowed them to thrive in environmental conditions that defeat modern people equipped with vastly superior technology. But the most profound legacy of cowboy winter survival isn't the specific techniques they developed or the equipment innovations they created. It's the demonstration that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation when survival depends on it. These cowboys proved that the limits of human endurance aren't fixed boundaries, but flexible capabilities that can be expanded through knowledge, preparation, and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. The techniques they mastered required levels of dedication, risk tolerance, and mental conditioning that most modern people would find impossible to achieve. Cowboys' discomfort and psychological barriers that had to overcome social taboos, physical, would prevent less motivated individuals from even attempting the most effective survival methods. They had to accept that survival sometimes require acceptable. They had to maintain hope-embracing practices that were revolting, dangerous, or socially and determination during conditions that would drive most people to despair. And they had to develop technical knowledge and practical skills that represented the absolute cutting edge of survival science, using only natural materials and human ingenuity. The cowboys who achieved mastery of winter survival became legendary not just for their individual accomplishments, but for their demonstration of what human beings are capable of achieving when the stakes are high enough and the determination is strong enough to refuse any outcome except success. Their story continues to inspire and challenge anyone who faces seemingly impossible odds, whether in wilderness survival situations or in any other area of life where success requires pushing beyond normal human limitations. They proved that the difference between success and failure often comes down to knowledge, preparation, and the mental conditioning necessary to continue fighting when conventional wisdom says that giving up is the only rational option. These cowboys didn't just survive the frontier winter. They conquered it, transforming deadly cold from an insurmountable enemy into a manageable challenge that could be overcome through human intelligence, determination, and the kind of survival wisdom that emerges only when failure means death, and success means the difference between seeing another sunrise or becoming another forgotten casualty of the unforgiving American wilderness. Their techniques may have been lost to history, but their example remains as powerful today as it was on those frozen nights when they proved that human beings equipped with nothing but knowledge, courage, and the absolute refusal to quit could sleep warm and wake up alive in conditions that should have killed them. That legacy continues to challenge and inspire anyone who refuses to accept that impossible odds mean inevitable defeat. The secret brotherhood of winter masters didn't just survive the closing of the frontier. They established a standard of human resilience and environmental mastery that continues to define what's possible when ordinary people develop extraordinary capabilities through necessity, experience, and the kind of determination that transforms survival from desperate struggle into confident mastery of even the most hostile conditions nature can create. But the most extraordinary aspect of cowboy winter survival wasn't the individual techniques or the equipment innovations. It was how these men developed what they called the sixth sense, an almost supernatural ability to predict and respond to environmental changes that could mean the difference between life and death. This wasn't mysticism or folklore. It was the result of years of conditioning that created heightened awareness of environmental cues that most people would never notice. Master winter cowboys could sense temperature drops hours before they occurred by detecting subtle changes in air pressure, humidity, and wind patterns. They could predict storm intensity by observing cloud formations, animal behavior, and atmospheric conditions that seemed insignificant to less experienced observers. Some claimed they could feel approaching blizzards in their bones, a phenomenon that modern science now recognizes as the ability to detect barometric pressure changes through joint sensitivity and other physiological responses. This environmental awareness extended far beyond weather prediction. Cowboys learned to read the climates, that might provide protection from wind or cold. They could locate landscape itself for survival opportunities and hidden dangers. They could identify natural windbreaks, thermal pockets, and sheltered areas that weren't obvious to casual observation. And they could assess ground conditions to predict drainage patterns, frost formation, and other factors that could affect their survival setup. The most experienced winter masters developed what they called ground sense, the ability to determine soil composition, moisture content, and thermal properties simply by observation and minimal testing. This knowledge was crucial for effective bedroll placement, firebed construction, and emergency shelter creation. Cowboys who possessed ground sense could set up superior sleeping systems in minutes, while less experienced men might struggle for hours to achieve inferior results. But perhaps most remarkably, these environmental masters learned to integrate weather prediction, landscape assessment, and tactical planning into comprehensive survival strategies that could adapt to changing conditions throughout the night. They didn't just prepare for current conditions. They prepared for multiple scenarios and contingencies that might develop as weather patterns evolved. The evolution of group survival tactics. As cowboy survival knowledge matured and spread throughout frontier culture, individual techniques began to merge into coordinated group strategies that transformed winter survival from personal struggle into organized operations. The most successful cattle crews developed what amounted to military precision in their cold weather protocols, with each member having specific responsibilities that contributed to collective survival. The watch rotation system was perhaps the most crucial group survival innovation. Cowboys would establish overlapping shifts throughout the night, where designated individuals remained awake to monitor conditions, maintain fires, and check on sleeping crew members. These weren't casual arrangements. They were carefully calculated schedules that ensured continuous surveillance while allowing maximum rest for the majority of the crew. Watch assignments were based on individual cold tolerance, experience levels, and specific skills that might be needed during different parts of the night. The most cold-resistant cowboys might take the pre-dawn shift when temperatures typically reach their lowest points. Men with the best weather prediction abilities would monitor conditions during periods when storm patterns were most likely to change, and cowboys with medical knowledge would be assigned to shifts when hypothermia and other cold-related emergencies were most likely to occur. The resource-sharing protocol allowed crews to pool their individual survival resources when conditions exceeded what any single cowboy could handle alone. This might involve combining bedroll materials to create larger heated areas, sharing body heat among multiple men, or coordinating equipment to construct group shelters that provided better protection than individual setups. But resource sharing went beyond emergency cooperation. The most advanced crews developed systematic approaches to optimizing survival resources across the entire group. Cowboys with superior bedroll systems might share techniques and materials with less prepared crew members. Men who had mastered heatstone preparation would create heating devices for the entire outfit, and specialists in particular survival techniques would teach and supervise other crew members to ensure everyone benefited from the most effective methods available. The communication system allowed cowboys to coordinate survival activities and emergency responses without compromising their individual sleeping arrangements. This involved standardized signals that could be used in complete darkness during storm conditions or when voice communication wasn't practical. Cowboys developed hand signals, equipment positioning codes, and sound patterns that could convey specific survival information across distances and through environmental barriers. These communication systems were particularly crucial during emergency situations when rapid coordination could mean the difference between successful rescue and tragic loss. A cowboy experiencing hypothermia could signal for help without leaving his bedroll. Someone who detected dangerous weather changes could alert the entire crew without waking everyone unnecessarily, and groups could coordinate complex survival maneuvers like shared body heat arrangements or emergency relocations without confusion or wasted effort. The supply chain innovations that enabled survival. Behind every successful winter cowboy crew was a sophisticated logistics system that ensured adequate supplies of survival materials throughout extended cold weather operations. This wasn't just about carrying enough food and basic equipment. It was about maintaining complex supply chains that could deliver specialized survival resources to remote locations under dangerous conditions. Chuck wagon operations evolved into mobile survival support systems that could manufacture, repair, and distribute the specialized equipment that winter survival required. Skilled cooks and camp tenders learned to produce waterproofing compounds, repair bedroll materials, and create custom survival gear using basic tools and materials that could be transported by wagon. The most advanced chuck wagon operations included primitive workshops where damaged equipment could be repaired or replacement items could be manufactured from raw materials. Cowboys learned to work leather, metal, and textile materials to create custom bedroll components, specialized clothing, and survival tools that were perfectly adapted to their individual needs and local environmental conditions. Supply depot systems allowed long-range cattle operations to pre-position survival resources at strategic locations along trail routes. These depots might include cached bedroll materials, emergency food supplies, medical equipment, and specialized cold weather gear that crews could access when their portable resources weren't sufficient for extreme conditions. But the most innovative aspect of cowboy supply systems was their ability to utilize local resources to supplement transported materials. Cowboys learned to identify and harvest natural materials that could be incorporated into their survival systems. This might include specific types of grass or plant materials that provided superior insulation, mineral deposits that could be used for heat storage, or animal resources that could be processed into waterproofing compounds or additional bedding materials. The economic calculations of survival investment. Cowboy winter survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about economic survival in an occupation where cold weather capability directly determined earning potential and career longevity. Cowboys who could work effectively during winter conditions commanded higher wages and better employment opportunities than those who were limited to fair weather operations. The cost of superior survival equipment represented a significant investment for men whose annual earnings were often quite modest. A week's wages, specialized cold weather clothing, complete high-quality bedroll system might cost the equivalent of several expenses, and the ongoing costs of maintaining boots and accessories could represent additional major repairing, and replacing survival equipment created continuous financial pressure on working cowboys. But cowboys understood that superior survival capability was an investment that would pay dividends throughout their careers. Men who could work comfortably in conditions that defeated less prepared cowboys could command premium wages during winter operations. They could accept employment opportunities that others couldn't handle, and they could build reputations for reliability and toughness that led to better job opportunities and higher pay scales. The most successful cowboys approached survival equipment purchases with the same strategic thinking that modern professionals might apply to career development investments. They researched the most effective equipment options, saved money specifically for survival gear upgrades, and made calculated decisions about which improvements would provide the greatest return on investment in terms of increased earning potential and reduced risk of career-ending injuries or health problems. Some cowboys even developed side businesses based on their survival expertise, manufacturing custom equipment for other cowboys, teaching survival techniques for fees, or providing specialized services during extreme weather operations. The knowledge and skills they developed for personal survival could become sources of additional income that helped offset the costs of maintaining advantage. As cowboy survival knowledge became more sophisticated and widely distribute superior survival capabilities, the transformation of survival into competitive winter survival capability evolved from basic necessity into competitive advantage that could determine career success and social status within cowboy culture. The men who achieved mastery of cold weather techniques didn't just survive better than their peers. They established themselves as elite practitioners whose skills were sought after and respected throughout frontier society. Reputation for winter survival mastery could open doors to employment opportunities that weren't available to ordinary cowboys. Trail bosses and ranch owners specifically sought out men who were known for their ability to work effectively in extreme conditions. These elite winter cowboys could command higher wages, better working conditions, and more respect from employers and peers than cowboys whose capabilities were limited to moderate weather operations. The development of survival expertise also created informal hierarchies within cowboy culture, where knowledge and skill in cold weather techniques determined social status and leadership roles. Cowboys who had proven themselves capable of surviving the worst conditions nature could produce naturally became leaders and mentors for less experienced men. Their opinions carried more weight in group decisions, and their techniques were studied and imitated by others seeking to improve their own survival capabilities. Competition between cowboys to develop superior survival methods drove continuous innovation and improvement in techniques and equipment. Men would experiment with new approaches, test different materials, and refine their methods to gain advantages over their peers. This competitive environment accelerated the development of survival technology and ensured that the most effective techniques would spread rapidly throughout cowboy culture. But competition also created pressure for secrecy and knowledge hoarding that could limit the sharing of their secrets to maintain competitive advantages, even when sharing saving information. Cowboys who developed superior techniques might guarantee that knowledge could save lives. This tension between individual advantage and collective survival created complex social dynamics within cowboy communities that could either enhance or hinder the development and distribution of survival knowledge. The medical consequences of extreme survival, the physical toll of repeated exposure to extreme cold conditions, created health challenges that affected cowboys throughout their lives, even after they had mastered survival techniques that kept them alive during dangerous weather. The human body wasn't designed for regular exposure to life-threatening cold, and even successful survival came with costs that weren't immediately apparent. Circulation problems were among the most common long-term consequences of winter survival careers. Cowboys who had survived multiple severe winters often developed chronic issues with blood flow to their extremities, resulting in increased susceptibility to cold injury, reduced manual dexterity, and persistent discomfort in moderate cold conditions that wouldn't affect normal individuals. Joint problems and arthritis were nearly universal among veteran winter cowboys, resulting from the combination of cold exposure, physical stress, and the awkward sleeping positions required for survival in extreme conditions. Men who had spent years sleeping on frozen ground in cramped bedroll configurations often developed chronic pain and mobility limitations that affected their ability to work of life and their quality. Respiratory issues were another common consequence of prolonged cold weather survival. Breathing extremely cold air, sleeping in poorly ventilated bedroll systems, and exposure to smoke from survival fires could cause permanent damage to lung tissue and breathing capacity. Some veteran winter cowboys developed chronic coughs, reduced lung function, and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections that plagued them for the rest of their lives. But perhaps most significantly, the psychological stress of repeated exposure to life-threatening conditions created mental health challenges that were poorly understood and rarely treated in frontier society. Cowboys who had survived multiple near-death experiences from cold exposure often developed anxiety disorders, sleep problems, and depression that affected their personal relationships and their ability to function normally in non-survival situations. The accumulation of these health problems meant that many cowboys who had been legendary for their winter survival capabilities found their careers shortened by the physical and mental toll of their achievements. The same techniques and experiences that had made them famous and successful also created health problems that eventually forced them into retirement or less demanding occupations. The forgotten innovations that changed everything. Among the most remarkable aspects of cowboy winter survival were the technological innovations that emerged from desperate necessity, but were never formally documented or recognized by mainstream society. These innovations often preceded similar developments in military or industrial applications by decades, representing genuine advances in survival science that emerged from the frontier laboratory of life and death experimentation. The thermal regulation clothing system developed by cowboys incorporated layering principles and material combinations that wouldn't be formally understood by textile engineers until well into the 20th century. Cowboys learned to combine different types of natural materials in specific arrangements that created optimal insulation while maintaining mobility and moisture management capabilities. Cowboys discovered that certain combinations of wool, leather, and plant materials could create clothing systems that automatically adjusted their insulating properties based on activity levels and environmental conditions. These weren't just layered clothing arrangements. They were sophisticated thermal management systems that used natural materials to achieve performance characteristics that modern synthetic materials struggle to match. The portable heating technology that Cowboys developed included innovations in combustion control, heat storage, and thermal distribution that represented genuine advances in applied thermodynamics. Their heat stone systems, firebed arrangements, and thermal battery devices incorporated engineering principles that weren't formally recognized by professional engineers until decades later. Cowboys also developed water management systems that could provide liquid water in sub-freezing conditions without the weight and complexity of modern heated containers. These systems used natural materials and simple physical principles to prevent freezing while maintaining water quality and accessibility throughout extended cold weather operations. But perhaps most remarkably, Cowboys developed what amounted to primitive weather prediction technology that allowed them to forecast dangerous conditions with remarkable accuracy using only natural observation methods. Their ability to predict temperature changes, storm patterns, and wind shifts often exceeded the accuracy of modern meteorological forecasting, demonstrating intuitive understanding of atmospheric dynamics that formal science is still working to explain. The social revolution hidden in survival techniques. The development of advanced winter survival capabilities didn't just change individual cowboys' ability to survive extreme conditions. It created social changes within frontier culture that challenged traditional hierarchies and created new forms of community organization based on survival competence rather than conventional social markers. Cowboys who possessed superior survival knowledge often became informal leaders regardless of their official status or social background. A young cowboy who had mastered advanced winter techniques might find himself training and advising older, more experienced men who lacked his cold weather expertise. This created situations where traditional age and experience hierarchies were supplemented or even overridden by survival competence. The sharing of survival knowledge created bonds between cowboys that transcended normal social boundaries of race, ethnicity, and economic background. Men who had kept each other alive through deadly conditions developed relationships based on mutual dependence and shared experience that were often stronger than family ties. These survival partnerships created informal networks of mutual support that functioned throughout cowboys' careers and beyond. The development of group survival techniques required levels of cooperation and trust that challenged the individualistic culture traditionally associated with cowboy life. Successful winter survival often depended on subordinating personal preferences to group needs, sharing resources that might be personally valuable, and accepting intimate physical contact that violated normal social conventions. These requirements for cooperation and interdependence created cowboy communities that were far more socially integrated and mutually supportive than the popular image of independent loners would suggest. The men who survived the worst conditions did so through sophisticated social organization and collective action that demonstrated the importance of community bonds in frontier survival. The transformation of survival knowledge into cultural values also influenced broader frontier societies' attitudes toward cooperation, preparation, and mutual responsibility. Communities that included men with advanced survival experience often developed more effective approaches to collective challenges like severe weather, resource shortages, and other threats that required coordinated community responses. The ultimate test that proved everything. The techniques, innovations, and cultural changes that emerged from cowboy winter survival received their ultimate validation during the catastrophic winter of 1886 to 1887. When conditions became so severe that they tested every aspect of frontier survival knowledge. This winter became the definitive proof of which techniques worked and which were inadequate for truly extreme conditions. Cowboys who had mastered the most advanced survival techniques not only survived conditions that killed thousands of cattle and many men, but they continued working throughout the worst weather, while less prepared individuals were forced to seek shelter in towns or abandon their operations entirely. The men who kept working during this winter demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost superhuman to those who witnessed them. The survival techniques that proved most effective during this ultimate test weren't necessarily the most comfortable or socially acceptable methods. The cowboys who survived and thrived used combinations of techniques that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible or reasonable. They employed methods that required sacrificing personal comfort, social conventions, and normal safety margins in favor of techniques that were proven effective under the most extreme conditions. The winter of 1886 to 1887 also revealed which survival innovations had genuine value versus those that were merely adequate for moderate conditions. Equipment, techniques, and strategies that seemed impressive during normal cold weather sometimes proved inadequate when conditions became truly life-threatening. Only the most thoroughly tested and refined approaches proved sufficient for survival during this apocalyptic winter. But perhaps most importantly, this winter demonstrated that individual survival techniques, no matter how advanced, weren't sufficient for the most extreme conditions. The cowboys, who not only survived but continued working effectively during the worst weather, were those who had integrated individual survival mastery with sophisticated group coordination and mutual support systems. The legacy of this ultimate test was the recognition that cowboy winter survival had evolved beyond individual technique into comprehensive survival science that incorporated equipment innovation, group coordination, psychological conditioning, and cultural adaptation into integrated systems that represented the highest level of human environmental adaptation achieved using natural materials and human resources alone, the mystery that modern science cannot solve. Despite extensive research into historical accounts and modern understanding of cold weather physiology, contemporary scientists and survival experts remain unable to fully explain how cowboys achieved the levels of cold weather performance that are documented in reliable historical sources. The combination of techniques, adaptations, and capabilities that these men demonstrated appears to exceed what modern science would predict as possible under the conditions they faced. Modern military survival training incorporates many techniques that were originally developed by frontier cowboys, but even with superior modern equipment and extensive scientific understanding, contemporary survival specialists acknowledge that they cannot match the performance levels that were routinely achieved by master winter cowboys using primitive equipment and natural materials alone. The physiological adaptations that veteran winter cowboys developed appear to have exceeded what modern sports science and environmental physiology would predict as possible through natural acclimatization processes. Their documented abilities to maintain function and performance in extreme cold conditions suggest levels of human environmental adaptation that may represent the absolute limits of what's achievable through natural conditioning. The psychological techniques that cowboys used to maintain mental function and decision-making ability under extreme stress incorporated methods that modern military and survival psychology are still working to understand and replicate. Their ability to maintain rational thought and coordinated action during life-threatening conditions demonstrates mental conditioning that exceeds what contemporary training methods typically achieve. But perhaps most mysteriously, the integration of physical techniques, equipment innovations, group coordination, and psychological conditioning that master winter cowboys achieved created survival capabilities that appear to be greater than the sum of their individual components. The synergistic effects of their comprehensive survival systems produce performance levels that seem impossible to explain or replicate using modern analytical methods. This enduring mystery ensures that cowboy winter survival remains not just a historical curiosity, but an ongoing challenge to our understanding of human potential and environmental adaptation. The techniques they developed and the capabilities they demonstrated continue to inspire and challenge anyone who faces extreme survival conditions, proving that human beings are capable of achieving remarkable things when survival depends on pushing beyond conventional limitations. The eternal inspiration of impossible achievement. The story of how cowboys slept warm and woke up alive in conditions that should have killed them represents more than just historical survival techniques. It demonstrates fundamental truths about human potential that remain relevant regardless of technological advancement or social change. These men proved that ordinary people can develop extraordinary capabilities when the stakes are high enough and the commitment is strong enough to refuse any outcome except success. Their achievement wasn't just about surviving cold weather. It was about transforming impossible challenges into manageable problems through knowledge, preparation, innovation, and the kind of determination that refuses to accept defeat even when defeat appears inevitable. The techniques they developed were remarkable, but the mindset that created those techniques was even more impressive. Cowboys who mastered winter survival didn't just endure extreme conditions. They learned to thrive in environments that were specifically designed to kill human beings, transforming deadly threats into routine challenges that could be handled with confidence and competence. Their example continues to inspire anyone who faces seemingly insurmountable obstacles in any area of life. The knowledge they accumulated, the innovations they created, and the cultural changes they produced demonstrate that human beings are capable of remarkable adaptation when survival requires it. Their story reminds us that the limits we accept are often self-imposed rather than actual boundaries, and that extraordinary achievement becomes possible when ordinary people refuse to accept ordinary limitations. But perhaps most importantly, their legacy demonstrates that individual excellence, while impressive, achieves its greatest impact when combined with collective effort and mutual support. The cowboys who achieved the most remarkable survival feats were those who understood that individual mastery was most powerful when integrated with group cooperation and shared knowledge. Their techniques may have been lost to history, but their example remains as powerful today as it was during those frozen nights when they proved that human determination, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle that nature could create. That lesson continues to challenge and inspire anyone who refuses to accept that impossible conditions mean inevitable failure. The cowboys who mastered winter survival didn't just survive the frontier, they conquered it, establishing standards of human achievement that continue to define what's possible when ordinary people develop extraordinary capabilities through necessity, experience, and the absolute refusal to quit. Their story remains a testament to human potential that challenges every generation to push beyond accepted limitations and achieve things that others consider impossible. In the end, the secret of how cowboys slept warm in conditions that should have killed them wasn't really about bedrolls, techniques, or equipment. It was about the fundamental human capacity to adapt, innovate, and overcome when survival depends on refusing to accept defeat. That capacity remains as powerful today as it was on those deadly winter nights when these remarkable men proved that human beings, equipped with knowledge, determination, and mutual support, could triumph over any challenge that nature could devise. Their legacy lives on in everyone who faces impossible odds and chooses to fight rather than surrender, who develops extraordinary capabilities rather than accepting ordinary limitations, and who understands that the greatest achievements come not from individual effort alone, but from the combination of personal excellence with collective determination to ensure that everyone survives and thrives, regardless of how hostile the conditions become. The winter masters of the American frontier didn't just sleep warm in deadly cold. They demonstrated that human beings are capable of achieving remarkable things when the alternative is unacceptable, and the commitment to success is absolute. That demonstration continues to inspire and challenge us today, proving that the limits we face are often the limits we accept, rather than the limits that actually exist. The final evolution of survival mastery that defied all logic. By the 1880s, the most accomplished winter cowboys had developed what they called the death dance, a survival technique so advanced and so dangerous that it was practiced only by men who had already proven themselves masters of every other cold weather method. This wasn't just another survival technique. It was a complete transformation of the relationship between human beings and deadly cold that pushed the boundaries of what seemed physically possible. The death dance involved deliberately inducing controlled hypothermia while maintaining consciousness and motor function through a combination of breathing techniques, mental conditioning, and precise physical movements that kept critical body systems functioning even as core temperature dropped to levels that would normally cause unconsciousness or death. Cowboys who mastered this technique could survive in conditions that were lethal even with the best equipment and standard survival methods. The process began with systematic preparation that took place over several hours before exposure to the most extreme conditions. Cowboys would consume specific combinations of foods that provided sustained energy while minimizing metabolic heat production. They would perform breathing exercises that increased oxygen saturation while conditioning their respiratory systems for the controlled breathing patterns required during the technique. And they would engage in mental preparation that bordered on meditation, conditioning their minds to maintain consciousness and rational thinking, even as their bodies entered states that normally caused confusion and disorientation. The actual death dance was performed during the coldest parts of the night, when standard survival techniques weren't sufficient to maintain life. Cowboys would begin by entering a state of controlled relaxation that reduced metabolic heat production while maintaining awareness of their physical condition. They would then initiate specific breathing patterns that maintained oxygen delivery to critical organs while allowing their core temperature to drop in a controlled manner. But here's where it gets truly extraordinary. As their body temperature dropped, these cowboys would perform carefully choreographed physical movements that kept blood flowing to essential organs while preventing the complete shutdown of circulation that normally occurs during severe hypothermia. These movements weren't random or desperate actions. They were precise, calculated exercises that maintained just enough circulation to prevent organ failure while conserving energy for survival. The most accomplished practitioners could maintain this state for hours, riding the edge between life and death while their bodies operated at temperatures that would kill unprepared men. They would monitor their own condition with remarkable precision, adjusting their breathing patterns and physical movements to maintain the delicate balance between energy conservation and essential body function. Cowboys who survived the death dance often described the experience as transcendent, claiming they could observe their own bodies from outside perspectives while maintaining control over physical functions that normally operated automatically. Whether this was actual out-of-body experience or simply the effects of controlled hypothermia on brain function, the results were undeniable. These men could survive conditions that defeated every other survival method. But the death dance came with risks that made even the most experienced winter masters hesitant to attempt it. The margin for error was so narrow that small mistakes in timing, breathing, or physical movement could result in irreversible hypothermia and death. Cowboys who miscalculated their body's responses or lost control of the technique would simply never wake up, dying peacefully in their bedrolls while appearing to sleep normally. The technique also required years of preparation and conditioning that built the physical and mental capabilities necessary for controlled hypothermia survival. Cowboys couldn't simply decide to attempt the death dance during an emergency. It required systematic training that developed the breathing control, mental discipline, and body awareness necessary for maintaining consciousness and motor function during extreme cold exposure. Perhaps most remarkably, the death dance created physiological changes that seemed to persist even after the immediate survival crisis had passed. Cowboys, who had successfully performed the technique multiple times, often developed enhanced cold tolerance and circulation capabilities that exceeded even the impressive adaptations of other winter survival masters. They became capable of comfortable function in moderate cold conditions that would require heavy clothing and heating for other people. The spiritual transformation that accompanied ultimate survival. Cowboys who had mastered the most extreme survival techniques often underwent psychological and spiritual changes that went far beyond improved cold tolerance or technical skills. The repeated experience of surviving conditions that should have been lethal created fundamental alterations in how these men understood themselves, their relationship to nature, and their place in the world. Many winter survival masters reported developing enhanced intuitive abilities that allowed them to predict weather changes, assess environmental dangers, and make survival decisions with remarkable accuracy, even when they lacked specific information about conditions. This wasn't just improved observational skills. It appeared to be genuine intuitive awareness that functioned independently of normal sensory input. Cowboys who had survived multiple near-death experiences from cold exposure often developed altered relationships with fear and death that allowed them to function calmly and effectively in situations that would terrify most people. They had faced their own mortality repeatedly and emerged victorious, creating psychological confidence that extended far beyond survival situations into all aspects of their lives. The spiritual aspects of extreme survival were particularly pronounced among cowboys, who had practiced techniques like the death dance that involved altered states of consciousness. Many reported profound spiritual experiences during their most extreme survival episodes, claiming direct communication with spiritual forces or deceased relatives who provided guidance during life-threatening situations. Whether these spiritual experiences were genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the effects of extreme stress and altered brain chemistry on consciousness, they created lasting changes in how these cowboys understood reality and their place within it. Many became deeply philosophical about life and death, developing perspectives that emphasized acceptance of mortality while maintaining absolute determination to survive whatever challenges arose. The integration of survival mastery with spiritual development created cowboys who possessed remarkable psychological resilience and emotional stability, even in civilian situations. They had learned to maintain hope and determination during the darkest and most dangerous conditions imaginable, creating mental strength that served them throughout their lives, regardless of the specific challenges they faced. But perhaps most significantly, these spiritual transformations often created strong desires to share their knowledge and help other people develop survival capabilities. Cowboys who had achieved the highest levels of winter survival mastery frequently became teachers and mentors, passing on their techniques to younger men who could benefit from their hard-won wisdom. The economic revolution hidden in survival innovation. The advanced survival capabilities that master winter cowboys developed created economic opportunities and competitive advantages that fundamentally changed how frontier business operated. Cowboys, who could work effectively in extreme conditions, commanded premium wages and had access to employment opportunities that weren't available to less capable men. Ranching operations that employed cowboys with superior winter survival skills could continue profitable activities during weather conditions that forced competitors to suspend operations. This created significant economic advantages during harsh winters, when cattle prices were typically higher due to reduced supply and increased difficulty in bringing products to market. The most successful ranchers actively recruited cowboys with proven winter survival capabilities, offering higher wages and better working conditions to attract men whose skills could mean the difference between profitable winter operations and catastrophic losses. This created a premium labor market where survival expertise translated directly into increased earning potential and career advancement opportunities. Cowboys who had achieved mastery of extreme survival techniques often developed side businesses based on their specialized knowledge. They might manufacture custom survival equipment for other cowboys, provide specialized services during extreme weather operations, or offer training and consulting services to ranchers and cattle crews preparing for difficult winter conditions. Some winter survival masters became legendary figures whose reputations extended far beyond their immediate working areas. Their services were sought after by ranching operations throughout the frontier, and their techniques were studied and imitated by cowboys who wanted to improve their own survival capabilities and earning potential. The economic value of advanced survival skills also created incentives for continuous innovation and improvement. Cowboys understood that developing superior techniques could provide competitive advantages that translated into better jobs, higher wages, and more stable careers. This economic motivation drove much of the innovation that pushed frontier survival science to its highest levels of development. But the commercialization of survival expertise also created tensions within cowboy culture, between knowledge sharing and competitive advantage. Cowboys who had invested years in developing superior techniques faced difficult decisions about whether to share their knowledge freely or guard it as trade secrets that provided personal economic benefits. The resolution of these tensions often depended on individual values and community relationships. Cowboys who prioritized collective survival and community welfare might share their knowledge widely, while those who focused on personal advancement might limit access to their most effective techniques. These different approaches to knowledge sharing created complex social dynamics within frontier communities. The technological legacy that influenced modern innovation. Many of the survival innovations developed by frontier cowboys contained principles and approaches that wouldn't be formally recognized by mainstream technology and engineering until decades later. Their empirical discoveries often preceded scientific understanding of the underlying principles that made their techniques effective. The thermal management systems that Cowboys developed incorporated heat transfer principles, insulation technologies, and temperature regulation methods that influenced later developments in military equipment, outdoor gear, and even industrial applications. Modern sleeping bag designs, cold weather clothing systems, and portable heating technologies can trace direct lineages back to innovations that originated in cowboy bedrolls and survival equipment. The psychological conditioning techniques that cowboys used to maintain mental function under extreme stress influenced later developments in military training, sports psychology, and stress management. Their methods for maintaining decision-making ability and emotional stability during life-threatening conditions provided templates that modern training programs still use for preparing people to function effectively under extreme pressure. Cowboys' approaches to group coordination and emergency response during survival situations contributed to the development of modern disaster response protocols, search and rescue procedures, and emergency management systems. Their understanding of how to coordinate multiple people's efforts during crisis situations provided organizational models that remain relevant for contemporary emergency operations. The materials, science innovations that emerged from cowboy survival needs influenced later developments in waterproofing, insulation, and textile technologies. Their empirical discoveries about material properties, treatment methods, and construction techniques provided practical knowledge that informed subsequent technological developments in outdoor equipment and survival gear. But perhaps most importantly, the integrated systems approach that cowboys developed for combining multiple survival technologies into comprehensive solutions provided organizational models for complex problem solving that influenced fields far beyond survival applications. Their understanding of how different technologies and techniques could be combined synergistically created templates for systems thinking that remain valuable for addressing complex challenges in many different fields. The cultural transmission of forbidden knowledge. As the frontier era ended and cowboy culture evolved, the most advanced survival techniques faced a critical challenge in cultural transmission. The knowledge that had kept men alive under impossible conditions needed to be preserved and passed on, but much of it was considered too dangerous or extreme for general distribution. The solution that emerged was the development of informal mentorship networks, where experienced winter survival masters would carefully select younger cowboys who showed exceptional promise and gradually introduce them to increasingly advanced techniques. This selective knowledge transmission ensured that the most dangerous methods would be learned only by those who had demonstrated the judgment and skill necessary to use them safely. These mentorship relationships often lasted for years, with master practitioners gradually revealing more advanced techniques as their students proved their readiness for increasingly challenging survival methods. The most dangerous techniques, like the death dance, might be taught only after students had demonstrated mastery of all lesser methods and shown the psychological maturity necessary for techniques that involved life-threatening risks. The cultural transmission process also involved the development of symbolic languages and coded references that allowed advanced practitioners to discuss dangerous techniques without revealing specific details to unprepared listeners. Cowboys developed systems of metaphors, stories, and indirect references that could convey technical information to initiated practitioners while remaining meaningless to casual observers. This approach to knowledge preservation created parallel levels of cowboy culture, where ordinary cowboys knew basic survival techniques, while inner circles of master practitioners preserved the most advanced and dangerous methods. The existence of these hidden knowledge networks wasn't widely recognized outside of cowboy culture, but they played crucial roles in maintaining survival capabilities that might otherwise have been lost. The selective transmission of advanced techniques also created quality control mechanisms that ensured dangerous knowledge would be learned only by those who could handle it responsibly. Master practitioners took personal responsibility for their students' readiness and would refuse to teach advanced techniques to anyone who showed poor judgment or inadequate skill development. But the informal nature of these knowledge transmission networks also created vulnerability to information loss. When master practitioners died without having fully trained successors, their most advanced techniques might disappear entirely. This created pressure for accelerated knowledge transfer that sometimes resulted in inadequately prepared students attempting techniques beyond their capabilities. The balance between knowledge preservation and safety considerations created ongoing tensions within these mentorship networks. Masters wanted to ensure their techniques would survive for future generations, but they also recognized their responsibility for preventing deaths that might result from premature or inadequate knowledge transmission. The final secrets that died with their creators. Despite the elaborate knowledge transmission networks that developed within cowboy culture, some of the most advanced survival techniques were never successfully passed on to future generations. The men who created these ultimate methods took their secrets to graves scattered across the frontier, leaving tantalizing hints of capabilities that modern researchers can only guess about. The most mysterious of these lost techniques were those developed by cowboys, who became legendary for survival capabilities that seemed to exceed human limitations. These men could reportedly survive in conditions that killed everyone else, work comfortably in temperatures that incapacitated other winter masters, and maintain physical performance that defied explanation, even by the standards of their remarkable peers. Historical accounts describe cowboys who could sleep naked on frozen ground, without any equipment, and wake up warm and comfortable. Others, who could work barefoot in snow for extended periods without frostbite damage. And some who could maintain normal body temperature while completely submerged in near-freezing water for periods that should have caused immediate hypothermia and death. These extreme capabilities were witnessed by reliable observers and documented in contemporary accounts. But the specific techniques that made them possible were never revealed by their creators. Whether these masters deliberately concealed their methods or simply died before they could teach them to others, their secrets vanished with their deaths. The mystery of these lost techniques continues to intrigue researchers who study frontier survival methods. The documented capabilities suggest levels of human environmental adaptation that exceed current scientific understanding of what should be physiologically possible. The techniques that enabled these capabilities represent lost knowledge that might have contributed significantly to human understanding of cold weather survival and environmental adaptation. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these lost secrets is the suggestion that human potential for environmental adaptation may be far greater than contemporary science recognizes. The cowboys who achieved these legendary capabilities may have discovered techniques for manipulating human physiology and consciousness in ways that mainstream science has never investigated or understood. The permanent legacy of impossible achievement. The story of how cowboys slept warm in deadly cold represents far more than historical curiosity about frontier survival techniques. It demonstrates fundamental truths about human potential that remain as relevant today as they were during those frozen nights when ordinary men achieved extraordinary things through knowledge, determination, and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. Their achievement proves that the boundaries we accept as limitations are often self-imposed rather than actual constraints. Cowboys who mastered extreme survival didn't just endure impossible conditions. They transformed impossible challenges into manageable problems through systematic application of knowledge, innovation, and mental conditioning that refused to acknowledge that failure was an option. The techniques they developed were remarkable, but the mindset that created those techniques was even more impressive. These men understood that survival wasn't just about equipment or procedures. It was about developing comprehensive capabilities that integrated physical preparation, mental conditioning, social cooperation, and spiritual resilience into unified systems that could overcome any challenge nature could devise. Their example continues to inspire anyone who faces seemingly insurmountable obstacles in any area of life. The principles they applied, systematic preparation, continuous innovation, collective cooperation, and absolute determination, remain as effective today as they were on the frontier. Their story reminds us that extraordinary achievement becomes possible when ordinary people refuse to accept ordinary limitations. But perhaps most importantly, their legacy demonstrates that individual excellence achieves its greatest impact when combined with collective effort and mutual support. The cowboys who survived the most extreme conditions understood that personal survival was most secure when integrated with community survival, and that the greatest achievements came from helping everyone succeed rather than focusing solely on individual advancement. Their techniques may be lost to history, but their example remains as powerful today as it was during those deadly winter nights when they proved that human determination, properly applied and mutually supported, could overcome any obstacle that existence could create. That lesson continues to challenge and inspire every generation to push beyond accepted limitations and achieve things that others consider impossible. The winter masters of the American frontier didn't just survive deadly cold, they conquered it, establishing standards of human achievement that continue to define what becomes possible when ordinary people develop extraordinary capabilities through necessity, experience, and the absolute refusal to quit. Their story remains a testament to human potential that challenges us all to recognize that the limits we face are often the limits we accept, rather than the limits that actually exist. In the darkness of those frozen nights, wrapped in their ingenious bedrolls and sustained by techniques that push the boundaries of human endurance, these remarkable men proved that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about maintaining the determination to thrive regardless of how hostile the conditions become. That determination, more than any specific technique or equipment innovation, remains their greatest gift to anyone who faces impossible odds and chooses to fight rather than surrender. Their legacy lives on in everyone who refuses to accept that challenging circumstances mean inevitable failure, who develops extraordinary capabilities rather than accepting ordinary limitations, and who understands that the greatest achievements come from combining personal excellence with collective commitment to ensuring that everyone survives and thrives. The cowboys, who slept warm in deadly cold, didn't just master survival techniques. They mastered the art of transforming impossible challenges into opportunities for demonstrating that human beings, when properly prepared and mutually supported, are capable of achieving absolutely anything they refuse to accept as impossible. The revolution that changed frontier medicine forever. What cowboys discovered about surviving extreme cold didn't just keep them alive during brutal winters, it revolutionized how frontier communities understood the human body's response to environmental stress and created medical knowledge that wouldn't be formally recognized by trained physicians for generations to come. Cowboys who had survived multiple episodes of severe hypothermia developed an intuitive understanding of how the human circulatory system responded to extreme cold that exceeded anything taught in medical schools of the era. They learned to recognize the subtle early signs of circulation failure, the barely perceptible changes in skin color and muscle response that preceded dangerous tissue damage. More importantly, they developed field treatment methods that could reverse these conditions using nothing but body heat, friction techniques, and rewarming procedures that saved limbs and lives when professional medical intervention was hundreds of miles away. The most experienced winter survivors became informal medical specialists within their communities, called upon to treat cold injuries and hypothermia cases that baffled trained doctors who had never encountered such severe environmental trauma. These cowboy medics understood that successful treatment of extreme cold exposure required precise timing and graduated rewarming that prevented the shock responses that could kill patients even after rescue from freezing conditions. So there you have it, the untold story of how cowboys conquered the deadliest enemy on the American frontier, not with guns or grit alone, but with ingenious bedroll systems, forbidden survival techniques, and a brotherhood forged in conditions that should have killed them all. These weren't just tough men. They were human beings who refused to let impossible odds write their obituary, transforming deadly winter nights into proof that when survival depends on it, ordinary people can achieve absolutely extraordinary things. These cowboys didn't just survive impossible conditions. They proved something that echoes through history to this day. When human beings refuse to accept defeat, when they combine knowledge with determination and individual excellence with collective support, there are no limits to what becomes possible. From the ingenious bedroll systems that turned canvas and wool into portable fortresses, to the forbidden techniques like the grease method and the death dance that pushed the boundaries of human endurance, these men developed survival capabilities that modern science still struggles to explain. They transformed deadly cold from an insurmountable enemy into a manageable challenge through systematic preparation, continuous innovation, and the absolute refusal to quit. But their greatest achievement wasn't any single technique or piece of equipment. It was the demonstration that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can develop capabilities that seem almost supernatural. The winter masters of the American frontier proved that human potential extends far beyond what we typically accept as possible, and that the limits we face are often the limits we impose on ourselves rather than actual boundaries. Their legacy lives on in everyone who faces impossible odds and chooses to fight rather than surrender. The principles they applied, systematic preparation, relentless innovation, collective cooperation, and unwavering determination, remain as powerful today as they were on those frozen nights when these remarkable men proved that with the right knowledge, preparation, and mindset, human beings can sleep warm and wake up alive in conditions specifically designed to kill them. So the next time you face a challenge that seems insurmountable, remember the cowboys who conquered the deadly cold of the American frontier. They remind us that there's no such thing as impossible, only unprepared. And with the right approach, even the deadliest conditions become just another problem waiting for a solution.